My name is Alison Killing. I'm trained as an architect. In fact, I am an architect, licensed in 2 countries. And after I graduated in that, I worked within the construction industry for a number of years, for structural engineers, for architects, for urban planners. And then I left that in 2010 to start working for myself.
You're listening to Exposing the Invisible, interviews with investigators about their methods, their communities, and what motivates them to keep going.
I had the ambition to build when I started working for myself, but the economy was very weak at that point, so there wasn't a lot of building going on, regardless of who you were and how experienced you were. And so I wasn't building, and I started to do other things instead. And I worked on research projects and community design and build projects. I did exhibitions. And then I started working on an online documentary about migration to Europe. And that was really the point at which my work shifted properly towards journalism. And since then, I've been working, doing sort of investigative projects often using my architecture skills. And we've been looking at the network of camps in Xinjiang, and I've been working with a team at BuzzFeed over the past 2-3 years to do that. The migration work had been focused a lot on sort of storytelling and how to tell this story effectively, whereas with the work that we did on Xinjiang, it was really the challenging thing was to find out what it was that was going on in Xinjiang. And so investigation was much more to the forefront in that. 2016 was a pretty tumultuous year for people in the UK and in the US, I guess, what with the Brexit referendum and then Trump being elected. And it just started to feel like that there were a lot of quite urgent social issues that we needed to deal with, and they needed an urgent response. And as much as I think that architecture and urban planning are really important, I still think that they're really important, but they're also incredibly slow. I mean, I used to work on 50-year strategic master plans. It's a sort of thing that you might not even live to see them completed. And so I was drawn to work that unfolded on a much shorter timescale, in fact, and that had the possibility of impact with that. And so I was kind of looking for opportunities to get involved with that. And they're quite difficult to come by. I don't have the sort of skill set that is commonly represented in newsrooms. This isn't a common or mainstream skill to find in newsrooms that I could just apply for a job doing the thing that I wanted to do. And yet I could see that I had skills that could be useful. And so I was looking for opportunities that went with that. And I guess the first thing that happened was that I saw the advert for the first Exposing the Invisible workshop. And I saw it and I was like, oh man, that looks really cool. But, I don't think I'm qualified. They're looking for journalists and investigators and people like that. And so, I got accepted to that workshop. I guess it was just the first time that I was sort of amongst a group of experienced journalists and investigators and being taken seriously amongst that group of people. Also just to be able to sort of talk with people and show them what it was that I did. What I found was that people often needed things which I had considered initially much simpler. Accessing historical satellite imagery and how you can use that and how you can access it. So from understanding sort of what other investigators needed, from understanding where they were, what they understood about what I did and what it was possible for someone with my skill set to offer, it opened the door to that actually opened the door to future collaborations. Mega and I met at that workshop. It was believed that there were about 1,200 camps in existence. Around 70 of them had been found. Mega had been the first journalist to visit one of them, and shortly after doing that work, she'd lost her visa for China, so she no longer had access to China, and yet was still very keen to continue working on this. Like, access to Xinjiang was difficult for any journalist who was trying to work in China, and kind of for two reasons. I mean, the first is the fact that Xinjiang is just so big, and so it's a huge amount of ground to cover to try and find all of these camps. But the other, like, more important issue is actually the Chinese government's control of information, or attempts to control information, and the harassment of journalists who want to work in Xinjiang, and also like harassment of sources. Like, people are very reluctant to speak to journalists because they fear, like quite rightly, that they could be sent to camps if they do. You know, they were reporting that for people trying to work in Xinjiang, like the Chinese police would be like staging car crashes to stop journalists traveling down certain roads to try and visit camps. So it was incredibly difficult to work there. Like, these challenges were something that satellite imagery was able to overcome, because it's something that is very, very difficult for the Chinese government to control. It can also deal with the issues of scale. And so we realised that, yeah, we had this complementary skill set, and we could potentially work together quite successfully to try and find this network of camps. I definitely had some experience with satellite imagery, and I had skills which allowed me to. So, I mean, one thing is that as an architect, what you tend to be, well, in fact, you have to be very good at thinking in 3 dimensions, and you have to be very good at moving between 2 dimensional representations of objects and a 3 dimensional version of that, whether that's a representation or the object itself. And so, having constantly, over the course of my like studies and over the course of my career, like been working with, you know, plans and satellite images and elevations and drawing sections through buildings, it was a very, very short step to be looking from there to be looking at satellite imagery and interpreting what we were seeing on the ground, to being able to look at photographs taken on the ground and to be able to match them to satellite imagery, what we were seeing there, and identify the different elements. That was very straightforward. I had 2 screens set up, and on one of them I had Google Earth, and on the other one I had a tool which Christo Bushek, the developer who worked with us, had built. And that had these point locations of all of the places where there were masked tiles superimposed over Google Maps. And I was just going through all of these points going like, no, 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 no. Like, maybe that's a thing. And I'd like zoom a bit in Google Earth and be like, no, not a thing. No, 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 no. And yeah, and then occasionally a yes, or occasionally rather a maybe. And those markers together built up a database, which that database then formed the real backbone of the project. We mapped out all of those masked tile locations, and it was a bit of a shock to find that there were 5 million. Like, I had thought that it was maybe going to be somewhere between 500,000 and 1 million, which is still actually a lot. But 5 million was like, you know, it's 10 times bigger than what I'd expected. Yeah, you sort of like realize that actually you've got 10 times more locations than you had originally expected, and you sort of do this like sharp intake of breath of like, oh god, like I hope we're going to be able to like still work through all of this, like how are we going to get it done? And then you take a deep breath and you're like, no, like of course we're going to manage to get it done, like this is the job, like this is just what we do. And then you sort of start working through it, and you find the ways that allow you to like narrow that down, which in this case was to say we're going to focus on the areas close to towns and the areas along sort of major infrastructure. In that way we managed to get it down to like 50,000 masked tile locations that we needed to look at, which is still a lot, but it was like I went systematically through those locations. I was managing to do like 10,000 in a week, which is quite a lot, and that was like quite an intense week, but it's also like it's manageable. You know, like 5 weeks of work is we're going to get there, and like we can see the end of that when we start. When we began, there were about 70 camps which had already been found. And so we knew quite a lot about like key characteristics of those camps. One thing that I found though very quickly, and I remember like calling up Megan to tell her about this because it was like such a shock to me. And it was like, oh my God, like I have to tell you this. Like we had expected to find around 1,200 of these camps, but after like even just a short amount of looking and trying to identify these locations, I realized that that almost certainly wasn't true. In the beginning, the program had really been a series of government-owned buildings, schools, hospitals, maybe empty apartment buildings around Xinjiang, which had been taken over and then in a matter of weeks or even days had been converted into prison camps. And what you saw with those camps was, like the giveaways with them was barbed wire fencing in the courtyards. You would see these passageways running between the buildings, like lined with barbed wire. You would see these blue-roofed industrial sheds springing up on the playing fields or like squished in between the buildings. And you would see these impromptu car parks which appeared like just outside the site. And then with the later ones, they were purpose-built, they were much higher security, much more intimidating facilities, and they started to look quite different. And they started to look much more like prisons which you can see elsewhere in China. Those facilities would have like these really thick perimeter walls. Like really thick would be like 1.5 to 2 meters wide walls going around these places. On either side of that wall, there would be like 1 or maybe 2 layers of barbed wire. There would be guard towers at the corners and at regular points along the walls. Because those places looked very similar to compounds elsewhere in China, also because we had, in some cases, tender documents or media reports, we were able to corroborate with quite a high degree of certainty that, in fact, a large number of these places were camps. And then for the rest, we could basically look at the similarities between Camp A, for which we had a load of corroborating evidence. We maybe had like an eyewitness statement. We might have a tender document. Perhaps a journalist had gone and visited. And then we would see exactly the same features in Compound B. And we could say like, okay, like Compound A we know is a camp. Compound B has the same features. We can be reasonably certain. Or like we can say that is also a camp, and we can say that with a very high degree of certainty. And then going to Mega and sort of being like, oh my God, I found this, or I found that. She was then working a lot with ex-detainees, doing these really detailed interviews that helped us to corroborate a number of locations, but it was also about sort of understanding what the human story of this issue was. What was going on more widely in Xinjiang? How did it feel for the people who were involved? What was the human cost of what was happening, of this massive detention program and program of oppression? And Mega did, this amazing job of packaging this as like, how can we tell this story effectively? We were able to like make a 3D model of one of the camps. Yeah, sort of give like this detainee's eye view of what life was like inside the camps. Working back and forth between like making this model, which I did based on like satellite imagery and then a lot of like quite basic architectural knowledge. I put together a draft of this model. And then from there, like we were able to start asking questions of the ex-detainees who had stayed in that place about, like trying to find out how big the cells are, because we were able to like count the windows along the facade. So we knew what the basic structure and what the structural grid was of the building and what a likely division inside was, but we didn't know how big the actual cells were. And so we were asking questions like, like how many windows were there in the cell that you were kept in? And it was like, oh, there was one. It was like, okay, very quickly then we were able to narrow down like how big that room must have been. And then sort of how many people were kept in there. And it was actually like a huge amount of overcrowding in that place that we were able to point to based on that reconstruction. Similarly, there were sort of structures in the courtyard of this prison and of this camp rather. These like wire pens, and we were able to like go to the detainees and say like, look, there's these wire pens in the courtyard, like what's going on there, like what happened there, and to have quite a good conversation using that model and using the questions that had come up in the course of my modeling to sort of say like, oh, actually there's a series of different like exercise yards for different categories of prisoner, but in fact people were very rarely allowed to go into them. They went out maybe once in 6 weeks. And so this model served as a really good basis for a discussion that Mega was able to have with the detainees, and to find out things like they actually hardly ever left their cells. Like they were incredibly confined and incredibly controlled within those places, only ever moving about like 10-15 meters from where they slept. Even on days where they went to the classrooms, never sort of feeling fresh air. This incredibly like claustrophobic, incredibly controlled experience, and that was something that we were able to get to using this model and like the techniques that I had, and then Mega's skills in an experience in interviewing. Migration Trail it's a mapped data visualization, and it follows two fictional migrants who are traveling to Europe in real time over 10 days. And then we had worked with one writer from Nigeria, one writer from Lebanon, to write the voices of those characters as a social media feed, which the audience could get either on the website itself or on Facebook Messenger. And then we also made a podcast series that looked at the wider issues around migration, which was non-fiction. I've actually been interested in sort of migration and refugee issues for a long time. I've got a master's degree in humanitarianism and development practice, as well as in architecture. So I'd been seeing sort of since about 2013 and into 2014 that there was quite a lot happening in terms of migration to Europe, in terms of irregular migration to Europe, or like a big increase in the number of people who were starting to make this journey through the central Mediterranean from Libya to Italy. And yet it felt like this issue wasn't getting the sort of media coverage that it actually deserved. And I remember reading something in The Guardian that said that even when they were like writing the articles reporting what was happening, those articles often had the lowest traffic on the webpage. So it's just like it wasn't being read. And so what I was interested in was like trying to find a new way of telling that story. And doing it through maps and data and telling it in real time seemed like it might be a good way to do that. The idea that like telling it in real time would help to make it more immediate for an audience. The other thing that I should say that we tried to do with that was to move beyond like just individual stories of the people making these journeys and start to talk about the political context and start to talk about European border policy and asylum processes which forced people into these journeys in the first place. It took sort of 2.5 years from beginning to end, although I wasn't working on that full time over that period. You don't really have a news focus per se, because you just, over that timescale, it just doesn't work to have that sort of focus. And the sort of advantage that it brings is that you can actually like step back and provide like this big like historical context and this big like policy context to what's happening. And that was what we felt was like the strength of what we were able to do. Stuff that it's actually like it's very, very difficult to provide in news reports. I mean, for issues of space, if nothing else. I mean, I would say that like probably the storytelling came to the fore much more in Migration Trail. It really felt like a design project to me, like this, like, okay, we've got this story, and like the story did need a huge amount of research, a lot of traveling, a lot of like interviews that I did. I sort of like traveled all of the major routes into Europe, like right back up into Northern Europe. I spent 2 weeks on one of the rescue ships in the Southern Mediterranean. So there was a huge amount of research that went into it, and it was, really about like, what's the most effective way to tell this story, and what are the different aspects of this story that we want to tell, and what are the different formats that we're using like, what are they good for? What can we do well with those? And then how do we get them to work together to tell this really effective story? Like the map was really good at sort of showing like the scale of what was happening. It was also really good at sort of linking together what I think for many people were like this really disparate set of stories that were spread across Europe about fires in the camps at Calais, about large numbers of people landing on the beaches in Lesbos, border walls springing up through the Balkans, and sort of showing how they could be tied together into one much bigger story. The social media storytelling that we did was really good at sort of showing like the personal side of like what it meant for the people who were like undertaking these journeys themselves. Like giving people this very like intimate picture of what it was like to do that journey and to be in touch with somebody who was taking that journey, because you were getting these messages in this very like personal, intimate space on your phone, and in a messaging app where it really did look like the messages were coming just to you. And then the podcast was also like a really nice format to work with, because there's a number of things that you can do quite successfully. Audio is a very good medium for discussion of quite complex issues. So that allowed us to really get into like the policy, the history of what was happening with migration to Europe. It's a medium that works very well for carrying emotion. So when somebody was like telling us about, the journey that they'd just gone on, like it could really successfully convey what it had been like for them. To do that and like the emotion that had been involved in that. And it's also a very good medium for recounting historical events. So somebody could be telling us about something that had happened like 2 months ago when they were leaving Syria, up to something that had happened yesterday when their boat sank and they had to be brought in by the Greek Coast Guard. And that could still work in that format and could work very successfully as within that format. I've been trained in design and then also like in making things. Obviously there's a creativity there, but you also have to like really understand techniques very well and what it's possible to do with them. That ability to sort of like develop concepts and then to come up with concepts and develop them rigorously, that helped a lot with the migration trail work that I was just describing, where you have a story and you're trying to work out how all of these different elements fit together successfully. That to me is very much a design problem. I really enjoy the sort of like that combination of creativity and technique and sort of understanding of technique that needs to go with it, where you're trying to understand like how it is that people are working with a given technology, or what it is that a given technology does. Because of the migration trail work, I had this really good understanding of how interactive maps work, and that allowed me to know that when I went to Baidu and I found these like strange blank squares in the locations of these camps, that wasn't just a problem with the map loading, and it wasn't just that there was information missing from the map and they'd put a blank tile in instead, but that there was something much stranger going on. Yeah, I mean, I find it quite enjoyable to like push and poke at these different things and try and develop these like different investigative techniques and ways that we can like maybe start to look at these issues, which are like by design very, very difficult for us to investigate, to look into what's happening in Xinjiang when the Chinese government has been working very, very hard to shut down access to information. And yet like we've been able to find these ways around that. Like I'm really enjoying what I'm doing now, but it's just really difficult to say what I'm going to be doing in 10 years and where I'll be. 10 years ago, I was convinced that I was going to be an architect and building buildings. I do now feel that I can more confidently call myself an investigator and refer to myself as a journalist. I feel like I've proved that I can do this now, and I have the right to say that about myself. I think I just don't know yet in what sense winning the Pulitzer has had an effect on our work. when the announcement was made in the middle of June, we were like right in the middle of this story where we were trying to calculate the capacity of all the camps. The following week we were still busy with that. Like, the work just goes on. There's plenty of work for us to do. I mean, it has been amazing to get that recognition. I think, for me and Christo, there's definitely a sense that like the different skills that we bring are like valid and useful and have like really very real contributions to make to the field of journalism and to investigation. Well, neither of those are traditional journalistic backgrounds, and so it was great to have those sort of techniques and approaches sort of recognised and validated in that way. But it's lovely, obviously.
Exposing the Invisible is a podcast by Tactical Tech with funding from the European Commission. Interview and production by Joe Barrett. From Tactical Tech, the Exposing the Invisible team is me, Wael Iskandar, Laura Ranka, Marek Dushinsky, and Christy Lang.